Okay, so I really want to talk about something, and I hope it's useful. Thanks for tuning in. So, an analogy as regards the dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and its dysregulation, often occurring due to trauma, stress, PTSD, grief, etc. Here's a pattern I see, because I work with a lot of trauma. We all have trauma, but a lot of trauma lends itself to mental, emotional stuff happening, long term especially. One of the observations I would say that I've come to as of late would be the fact that much of the time, especially with long past traumas, childhood stuff, we ask the question, how does this still affect a person now, right? The explanation, oh, well, PTSD, they're having flashbacks, emotional flashbacks, etc. And so that keeps taking them back to the trauma. I'm not so sure that that is the best or the only explanation for what's happening. I wonder sometimes if the problem or the bigger part of the problem originates from our response to the trauma, particularly on the emotional level. Let me give you an analogy for this. This comes from a physician who wrote a book that I absolutely love, that I highly recommend, called The Gift of Pain is the name of the book. The physician's name is Paul Brand. He worked with leprosy patients in India for many years. Actually revolutionized the field in terms of how leprosy is understood. Because you look back thousands of years, and leprosy was this horrifically disfiguring disease, missing limbs and fingers and noses. And in India in particular, to have leprosy was to be part of the untouchables. During the caste system, the absolute lowest caste that you could possibly be in was to be an untouchable. And that was where the lepers were placed. Part of that coming from this context of fear of this horrifically disfiguring disease. So Paul Brand worked amongst these patients. He was an orthopedic hand surgeon and was often in a position trying to repair their function of their hands so they could regain the ability to use their hands. And at some point, he's sitting under a tree observing a woman cooking over an open fire, and there's a man with leprosy nearby. She drops her utensil for cooking into the fire, motions to the leper to come over. He comes over and reaches into the fire and fishes out the cooking utensil. Gives it to her. Brand experiences an epiphany. Could it be that this horrifically disfiguring disease that we're all scared to death of actually occurs, that the sequelae, the problems, come about due to this invasion of the boundary between self and non-self? Mycoplasma leprae attacks the nerve endings. It leads to an inability in the extremities, in particular, to not being able to feel pain. And Brand transforms the field by arguing that this is the problem. The inability to feel pain drives the majority of the sequelae and problems with leprosy. I mean, leprosy itself is surprisingly difficult to catch. It's surprisingly, I mean, I don't want to denigrate it, but it's a pansy bacteria. It's not that virulent and bombastic. I mean, there have been researchers in the field of leprosy that have injected themselves with the bacteria and not been able to come down with it. So it does rely on a certain kind of susceptibility. But as Brand found out, it does not lead to this horribly disfiguring disease path. Those results happen due to an inability to feel pain and perceive the boundary between self and non-self. And so the leper reaches into the fire, grabs the utensil out, and doesn't see his own hand as part of himself. It has been my observation and my experience that some of the time, the hanging around and the problems with trauma are very similar in phenomenon to leprosy. Allow me to explain. One of the things that happens with any kind of trauma, it doesn't matter if it's, relationship trauma from being hooked up with a narcissist, to physical trauma, to childhood abuse, to neglect, etc. The sequelae of that is often a blurring of the boundary of self. Where do I begin? Where does the world end? Because if you have a perpetrator who invades, whether that be sexually, whether that be physically, and whether it be mental, emotionally, where this isn't you. Jen, you're not feeling sad. No. And they, the narcissist will deny your experience to the point that you think, well, yeah, maybe I'm not feeling sad. I don't know. And it starts to get really blurry. You're confused. Where do I end? I thought I was feeling X, but apparently I'm not. Apparently this person's going to tell me. So that pattern of trauma, the same thing with, this isn't your body. I'm going to rape you. It's not your body, it's mine. If you have that kind of pattern perpetuated, very much like the leper, the person who's been traumatized stops knowing where they end and where self ends and where somebody else begins or where the world begins. And one of the things that I've observed happens over and over again is, in particular with the emotions, is much like the hand, the emotions get tied to the trauma. So, and sometimes it starts off as a survival mechanism. I can't feel in this scenario. It's not safe for me to feel. Therefore, sadness, anger, etc., those get squelched, suppressed, pushed away, shoved into the closet, and we're walled off from that a bit. That pattern can continue. And like I said, the boundary being blurred, we start to go, these emotions, that's not me. That's part of the trauma. I'm going to keep viewing that as part of the trauma and not me. I'm not going to integrate these emotions with me because they're scary, they're dark, they might be ugly. And one of the things that Brand comes to in terms of pain, which is very similar, again, analogy, Jen likes analogies, would be the fact that with pain, it whispers before it screams. So he's hiking one day and he solves one of the problems he's been trying to solve regarding leprosy patients. They get issues on their feet. They have these weird injuries that occur that he can't figure out why do they occur. They all seem to have these similar patterns where they get ulcers. And as he explores this idea, he comes to realize that you have to understand pain. Pain whispers before it screams. So a person who experiences pain in a normal capacity will be hiking and almost on the unconscious, imperceptible level, very slight modifications to their gait, because you start to have something uncomfortable in your shoe. It's rubbing in a way where it might turn into a blister. You don't even necessarily consciously think, oh, I'm getting a blister. You adjust your gait. You shift the positioning of where your foot is in the shoe. Maybe you take your shoe off and your boot and your 2 pairs of socks that you have on. After you set your backpack down on Wicklow, because you're feeling a slight weirdness and you are not going to have a blister develop because you got to go 100 miles, right? This is a long trek, 4 or 5 days. And so you got to keep the feet good. So you listen to it, right? Brand recognizes this kind of thing happens in someone who feels pain. But in the absence of pain, the leper has the same identical gait and doesn't change the gait over the course of 6 hours of hiking. Or even sitting in a chair for an hour. Doesn't shift their positioning. They sit unnervingly still in a weird way. They don't reposition because there's no message that says, you're uncomfortable here. This is going to turn into a weird tweak in your back, and then it's going to turn into a bigger problem. It is the same in my experience with our emotions. And others would agree with me. Emotions whisper before they scream. Here's another analogy. The 2 parents that just had the 14-month-old baby, well, 14 months ago they had a baby. They're going to have a night out at the finest restaurant. They're going to go eat some delicious food. Babysitter cancels last minute. So now Timmy is going along with them because they're not going to cancel their plans. They're starved for adult time. So they're sitting having this wonderful, pleasant conversation, and Mom wants to finish her thought, and Timmy starts wanting their attention. He needs attending to. Mama, dada. Mom wants to finish her sentence, her story to her lover about what happened, etc. And so what does she do? She ignores Timmy. And Dad also wants the same thing, just to have an adult conversation all the way through. And so Timmy gets ignored. And what does Timmy do? He ups the ante. So now he's gonna start taking a spoon and banging it on the tray of the high chair. He's gonna start throwing the peas and carrots into the innocent bystander's hair. He might start screeching. And then Mom and Dad, now that the little volcano over here is erupting, have to deal with the scenario. They have to save face, because the Joneses are sitting over there and watching. They're gonna judge those terrible parents, and it's disrupting the whole restaurant. How dare they? And so they respond, get it, okay, contain him, get him, give him what he wants, so he'll stop whatever. And now they've reinforced a pattern. And sometimes Timmy, being very quick to assess, learns to expedite the process by starting with the tyrannical behavior, right? Over time, this happens. He starts to jump quick to, I'm going to throw the food. I'm going to screech. Because initially, Mom and Dad didn't listen when he was whispering. The same thing happens with our emotions. Our emotions will whisper to us, and we often denigrate them, suppress them, turn them off. You know, I'm feeling mildly annoyed that she is texting me now. Whatever it is. I mean, the emotion is there. For whatever reason, we've learned not to say to someone, hey, you're annoying me. We suppress it. Or we've learned just to push back from these experiences, and so then they get louder. They get more intense. They can reach a point where they spill over into other areas of our lives. I mean, this is sometimes the state I'm dealing with in my office, is if someone's suppressed long term, their experience can be like the ball in a pinball machine, where because the emotions have been ignored and denigrated and suppressed and not given their time and their space, start to make the message louder and even take over, steamroller the intellect. And now it's out of balance. Now we have this emotional dysregulation that's happening. And ironically enough, the way to address it and to deal with the emotional dysregulation is to go into the emotion, not the intellectual thinking mechanism. That's more of the same. That's ultimately that's another form of suppression, another form of avoiding, is to intellectualize or analyze or, overthink it. Instead, we have to go into the feeling mechanism. We have to try to understand what it is that's happening and orient ourselves where we attend to the emotions to understand what the message is. And a lot of us struggle with that. We struggle, I would say culturally, the dominant force is on the intellectual side and the analytical and the rational, logical side. That trumps and suppresses and rules over the emotional landscape. And the danger is this can go on long enough where it's not so much a choice anymore. I ultimately think this is a Jenn's theory, okay? But I wonder if potentially some of our extreme states that are not so treatable, let's say NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, I wonder if some of the time a person gets there. First of all, I don't think you're not born with it. That's my opinion. I think it's created. But I think one of the routes to creating such a scenario is to a long-term denigration of the emotional landscape, suppressing the emotions, walling off from them, not going into the intellectual arm, analyzing, and refusing to get around that painful space, the emotional landscape of it. I think you can reach a point where you lose empathy, you lose compassion, you start manipulating. That recipe looks to me like one of the ways, I don't know if it's the only way, that can happen is through this denigration and suppression of the emotions. It's interesting to me that we have, if you look at our culture is pretty narcissistic in general. One of the reasons narcissistic personality disorder is so prominent, in my opinion, is because we have a narcissistic culture. And so it propagates more of that. And also, if you look at the context, emotions are, culturally are denigrated. Now, I know that's not, I know if I go over on this side, some will say, correlation doesn't equal causation. No shit, Sherlock. But I find it interesting that we have these patterns emerging where, if you look at some of the dominant features in our culture, narcissism being one of them, and you also look at denigrating and suppression of emotions being another one, you wonder if that's part of the pathway to develop such a thing. So all that to say, looking at the emotions as non-self, as pushing them into the trauma ball of wax, feeds the fire of the trauma and the HPA axis dysregulation and dysfunction perpetuating and continuing. And so it's my belief that we can address this by first starting with an orientation towards the emotions like we would a small child. We attend to that child. We start to try to understand what they're trying to communicate. We may not understand the language. If you're talking about an infant, the only language an infant has really is crying. And so you attend to that. You ask, what might this crying child be trying to communicate to me? Oh, perhaps this child needs to eat. Perhaps this child is hungry. Perhaps this baby wants to be held. Perhaps, they need a diaper change. And in attending, you start to learn patterns. And this is the same thing we do with our own emotional landscape, especially if we've been cut off for a long time. And so you start to try to put pieces together. Oh, I'm observing that I am feeling this. Let's try to look at the pattern in the landscape around that. Why might I be feeling that? And in so doing, we heal those pieces. So, in summary, read the book, Healing Through the Dark Emotions. She speaks to this much more aptly than I am able to describe in the course of even a longer video. But it is definitely a pattern I see in terms of HPA axis dysregulation and dysfunction, perpetuating and continuing, is this piece of avoiding, suppressing, shoving in the closet the emotions, and then the this response to that being that the emotions up the ante. So we have a choice. We can respond. We can start changing how we orient to the emotional child in us. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this is helpful. Audio.